Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. At a time when India faces the worst possible economic and health crisis, there's also a worrying and disturbing spike in anti-Muslim sentiment as well as Islamophobia. With me to discuss both these issues is India's foremost public intellectual, the well-known historian Ramchandra Guha. Ram Guha, as I said, it's not just that we suffer from coronavirus and a lockdown, but now on top of that, there's a worrying spike in anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia. It's physically manifested itself against Muslim vegetable vendors, milk sellers, patients going to hospitals in Meerut and Ahmedabad. But on social media and television, it's directed at the entire Muslim community. And it seems now even Hindu expatriates in the Gulf have got infected. How do you explain this?
Well, I think times of fear and illness bring out the worst in people. There's some historical analogies during the time of the Black Death, the plague in 14th century Europe. The majority Christians treated the minority Jews as, in the same kind of way. They demonized them, they attacked them, they falsely blamed them for the problem. All over, medieval Europe, synagogues were burned, Jews were lynched and beaten up. But we are living in a democratic, modern society. So one would not expect this to happen. Unfortunately, it is happening for two reasons. One is, you pointed out, the extremely irresponsible and tendentious behavior of many sections of the media, and particularly Hindi language, though not only exclusively Hindi language television channels, but also the silence and complicity of our political class. Today, there was a small piece of good news, which is in Mumbai, a middle class man. There was a video that went viral. His wife was buying something from a vendor, and he said, no, he's a Muslim, and he refused to let his wife buy what they needed for their house. And today, he has been arrested. Now, if prompt action is taken by the administration, by the police, and backed up by strong statements by the political class, surprisingly, or quite remarkably, given his past political background and the position of the Shiv Sena, Uddhav Thackeray from the beginning has been saying, do not communalize, do not demonize. And other chief ministers have been saying that too. But the prime minister and the home minister the prime minister is very slow and the home minister is silent. So so I think in that sense, the reason 21st century India is depressingly recalling the worst times of medieval Europe, the bigotry of medieval Europe, is because I would say a combination of the media and the complicity of the media and the top central leadership.
Let's explore those reasons one by one, and let's begin with the complicity of the media. Everyone seems to accept that the present rise in anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia started with the irresponsible behavior of the Tablighi Jamaat. But the media jumped onto this. It immediately coined slogans like Corona Jihad, Corona Terrorism, as well as Super Spreader Mullana.
Correct.
And the problem was that the media deliberately and consciously ignored the fact that the Delhi police and the Delhi government also had a role and responsibility for permitting the Tablighi congregation to happen. And it completely overlooked the fact that by one count at least, 8 Hindu temples all over the country on those same dates as the Tablighi had organized public events with thousands of people present. So in its selectivity, in choosing to target the Tablighi and ignore the Delhi government and Delhi police, or in choosing to target Muslims and ignoring the fact that Hindus were equally guilty, is the media guilty of whipping up Islamophobia?
Without question. So there's no doubt that the leadership of the Tablighi in Nizamuddin acted irresponsibly. Foolishly, irresponsibly, arrogantly, stupidly, and they must be brought to book. But you're quite right. Meetings were being held elsewhere, the Delhi police, the Delhi administration, and even the central government, because many of the participants to these markas were coming from countries that had already seen several corona cases. Uh, uh, by all means, hold those guilty of irresponsibility to account, but be responsible about how you view, present, interpret one isolated incident. It was a tragic incident. It could have happened in Tirupati, it did not happen. It could have happened in Ayodhya, it did not happen. It happened in one place where people were in an enclosed space that come from different parts of India, different parts of the world. So even after the meeting had ended, they couldn't go back easily. But understand that, let the authorities, focus on who is guilty, but to, make, as you say, and it was not just the media. I come from Karnataka, which is generally has a reputation for tolerance compared to some other states in India. But many of the ruling party MLAs and MPs were talking the language of Corona jihad, coronavirus, uh, prescribing, advocating to their constituents that they boycott all kinds of Muslim vendors, shopkeepers, artisans, tailors, and clearly the media had whipped it up. But some prompt statements from the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister have to wait so long, and only after the oil-producing countries of the Gulf rightly chastised us, did he have to intervene? So
I'll come
that's
to the Prime Minister.
if
Ram,
that-
I'll come
yeah,
I'll
sorry.
come to the Prime Minister in a moment's time. Let's stick to the media for a little while longer. I'm not about to do whataboutery, by no means. But the media picked on this Tablighi Jamaat roughly at the same time. NDTV reported that a man called Suresh, and I'm deliberately taking his name because it will give away his religion, had come to Morena in Madhya Pradesh from Dubai and organized a wake for his mother, where 2,000 people were invited. Afterwards, he and his wife and several others actually came down with COVID, as a result of which those 2,000 had to be quarantined. Now, that is an event that was almost as bad as what the Tablighi had done, but the media never brought it up, it hardly mentioned it. And I'm not saying that whataboutery is essential, not at all. But at a time like this, and given the fragility of relations in our country, particularly after the CA protest, shouldn't the media have balanced things so that it didn't look as if one community alone is to blame?
Large sections of the media have been communalized for a very long time. They're reporting on Kashmir, for example. For a very long time has seen every Kashmiri protester as a terrorist, as a jihadist, as an Islamic radical. So in that sense, the media was behaving true to type. And in that sense, I would still say that it's the larger political environment and the silence and the complicity of the top leadership that is responsible. I'll give you one striking example that just comes to mind, but is utterly relevant. In when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated, there could have been a pogrom against Muslims, but Jawaharlal Nehru stopped it. And he pointed out that it was the Hindu that killed Mahatma Gandhi to make sure it wasn't communalized. Right. Now, I think in that sense, so I absolutely am critical of the media, of the tendentious reporting of the media, the hysteria of the media, the irresponsibility of large sections of the media, many particular television channels whom I won't name. Anchors who go out of their way to inflame for TRPs, to sensationalize for TRPs. But still, I would say they are a secondary, they're a secondary kind of a party in this whole game.
Let's then come to, in fact, the way in which the government has actually used the Tablighi Jamaat to try and explain how coronavirus is spreading. I'll start with Love Agarwal's press conferences, which are hugely viewed. At least on two occasions, he's used the Tablighi Jamaat event to explain coronavirus. First, on the 5th of April, he said, had Tablighi Jamaat not happened, India's doubling rate would have been half as bad as it actually is at the moment. Therefore, at least 50% of the doubling rate was to be blamed on Tablighi Jamaat. And then on the 18th of April, he went out of his way for almost 2 minutes to reveal details of what percent of which cases in different states were Tablighi Jamaat connected. Now, in a pandemic, is this sort of detailed information necessary, or does it in the Indian circumstances amount to pointing the finger and actually appointing blame?
The latter, it is unnecessary, it is tendentious, mischievous, it is an incitement to polarization. But the gentleman you mentioned, who's a lowly joint secretary in the health ministry, could not have done it more than once without the tacit or explicit approval of his minister, of the PMO, and of the cabinet. So he likewise is an instrument, maybe a kind of furthering instrument, a cynical instrument of the political establishment. It would not have happened in different circumstances, and he's not doing it on his own. Mr. Love Agarwal is not making up the religious profiling. He has been explicitly told to go ahead and do it. And only again, after a long time, it took 2 or 3 weeks for instructions to be issued that religious profiling in government statements would not be allowed. So even in this case, I wouldn't blame him. I mean, of course, he should be principled enough to say, I won't do it. Fali Nariman resigned from his job the day he emerged as Additional Solicitor General, the day the emergency was proclaimed. So some public officials have a spine, most don't. They go along or they are quiet. But in this case, he was doing what his bosses, right from the top, wanted him to do.
Let's then come explicitly to the Prime Minister. It's an example you brought up twice. Now, as I notice it, beyond an anodyne and tepid comment on the 19th, when the Prime Minister said, and I'm quoting, COVID-19 does not see race, religion, color, caste, creed, language, or borders before striking. Beyond that anodyne comment, the Prime Minister has had nothing to say as Muslims have been targeted and demonized. What do you make of that inexplicable silence? One would have thought that at this moment he would have risen up in their defense, admonished his own countrymen for their behavior, and yet he's been completely silent.
But this is true to character, Karan. If you go to look back at the lynchings of people in his first term, he was silent for a long time, and then again he issued an anodyne statement when he was compelled to by the wave of chorus. He's also used, I must say, I think in his speeches, on television after the pandemic came, two things are noticeable. One has been widely commented upon rightly, which is the class bias. There's repeated references to the balcony, which clearly poor people don't have balconies. The indifference to the migrant workers, but also the religious bias. He's repeatedly used Hindu imagery. He's talked about 7-step, Saptapadi, he's talked about Diyas, he's talked about Lakshman Rekha. In the last speech he gave, he mentioned many festivals, but conspicuously failed to mention Ramzan and Eid. Yesterday he made partial amends for that. But it's part of a pattern. It's part of a pattern, and it's part of a larger disturbing change that's taking place in our society and in our country, Karan. And if you allow me to just spend a minute on that. As I said, this is not the first time the media has reacted like this. It's a pattern that's been going on for several years. It's not the first time that the BJP's social media cell has been behaving in this communalizing things. It's not the first time the Prime Minister has been silent when he should be active. What is happening here, and has been happening, I would say, ever since Mr. Modi took power in 2014, is the steady, systematic, deliberate conversion of India into a Hindu majoritarian state. Till 2014, one could plausibly argue that India was an exception in South Asia. That while Bangladesh and Pakistan were Muslim majoritarian states, and Myanmar and Sri Lanka were Buddhist majoritarian states, Indian minorities really had a second-class place. In India, at least in theory, according to the constitution, according to the proclamations of our political leaders, we did not believe in religious discrimination. But from 2014, we are, so to say, approximating the South Asian majoritarian pattern. We are becoming more and more like a Hindu Pakistan or a Buddhist Burma with every passing month, and the pandemic is accelerating that.
Let me make, at this particular specific point, a blunt question to you. Many people say the way the media is behaving, the way the government is deliberately briefing, relying upon the Tablighi Jamaat to explain the spread of coronavirus, the way the Prime Minister is silent, or when he speaks in anodyne, tepid terms. This is all proof that actually anti-Muslim prejudice and Islamophobia lie just skin deep in India. And despite the fact that 15% of our fellow citizens are Muslims,
yes,
you only need to scratch the surface for this hateful prejudice to come up. Would you agree with that view of the Indian people that we are actually anti-Muslim in our attitude?
Well, certainly it's showing some very disturbing and distressing aspects to our compatriots, and not just the media, not just the political class, not just the ruling party, but ordinary people when they imbibe this kind of hatefulness. At times of insecurity, these things accelerate. And that's why it's particularly important for a wise political leadership. It's particularly wise for the Prime Minister to follow what the Chief Minister of Kerala or the Chief Minister of Maharashtra or the Chief Minister of Chhattisgarh has been doing, where they've deliberately tried to bring out the best in us, to make ordinary Indians rise above their religion, their caste, their class, and think of the larger good. So I hope, you're right. I mean, at times one feels that this is, just as Ambedkar said famously, democracy is top dressing on Indian soil. Maybe secularism and pluralism is also top dressing on Indian soil. So some of those depressing thoughts come.
I'm going to ask you to be blunt. Are you agreeing that anti-Muslim prejudice is skin deep in India and can very easily surface?
It can in many parts of India, particularly in northern and western India. Somewhat less so in eastern and southern India, but certainly so. I think it is.
Are you also saying that the Prime Minister's silence is letting this happen? I'm not saying that he wants it to happen, but he's permitting it to happen. He could stop it, and in not stopping it, he's allowing it to happen.
Yeah, but again, it's a part of a larger structural change in Indian society. This is a Hindu majoritarian government. It's qualitatively different from the first NDA, where Vajpayee had people like George Fernandez, Mamta Banerjee, completely secular people like Yashwant Sinha, Jaswant Singh in his as major cabinet ministers who could come out in defense of the rights of minorities and of the working classes if need be. So we now have, for the first time in our history as a republic, an explicitly Hindu majoritarian government, and the minorities and the poor are paying the price for that.
Understandably, at the moment, India is facing a lot of criticism in the Western media for its treatment, or should I say mistreatment, of its Muslim citizenry. But now, in addition, the Organization of Islamic Countries, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and even Sharjah royalty are expressing their concern. How much damage has been done to India's image internationally?
It's huge, Karan. And it's huge particularly because under the Modi government, especially after demonetization, our economy has been slipping. If your economy is doing well, you can get away with authoritarianism, get away with bigotry. The Chinese have been truly awful to their Muslim minority. But as long as the economy was doing well, the West was not that concerned about it. If your economy is doing badly and your secular principles are being violated every day, then clearly that it's that deadly combination of the two that is leading to our extraordinary drop in global standing. I mean, we have no friends, more or less. All the soft power accumulated over the last 50 or 60 years by successive prime ministers who portrayed India as an open, plural, outward-looking democracy, all that capital has been frittered away in the last few years.
My last question for this part. Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi not only was dismissive of the international criticism that India faces, but he went one step further. He said, and I'm quoting him, India is heaven for Muslims. Is this true? Heaven for Muslims?
I don't know which Muslims he's been talking to or where he's been going. I mean, it's the most ludicrous statement made by a cabinet minister. It's like alternative reality. It kind of almost matches President Trump's descriptions of what is going on in the world. I mean, it's completely farcical.
My last question. With the exception of the rich, the influential, and the powerful, is India heaven for anyone?
No, it isn't. It isn't. I think to some extent, it's the middle class did, in the years of liberalization, 90s, 2000, the middle class did expand its opportunities. Many small town people were able to move into, and so also I would say it's probably 30-70 rather than 5-95. But I'd say, Karan, I'd say there.
Very quickly, because I don't want to go on with this for too long.
There are four discriminated groups in India structurally: Dalits and Adivasis, whose discrimination is recognized in our constitution, Muslims and women in each of these categories. So I'd say, as a republic, we are failing in meeting, in assuring equality, that is social, cultural, economic, political equality to Dalits, Adivasis, women, and Muslims.
Let's take a break at that point. When I come back, Ramgua, I want to talk about the fact that last Sunday you announced you have broken your 6-year relationship with the Hindustan Times because they refused to publish a column you'd given them as you'd given them. And I want to ask you, what was that column about? And why did the paper find your views unacceptable? That's in a moment's time. But first, a message from our sponsor, Glenlivet.
Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is India's best known and most highly regarded public intellectual, the historian Ram Guha. Ram Guha, last Sunday, you terminated a 6-year relationship with the Hindustan Times and ceased being their main columnist on Sunday because, as you said, they had refused to publish an article you had given on the manner in which the central government wants to change the central vista in Delhi. So let me ask you, what was it that you wrote about the Central Vista plans, and what did the Hindustan Times find so unacceptable or so objectionable?
So this was an article arguing that the Central Vista plan was always controversial. Its aesthetics of its design had been sharply criticized by some of our most reputed architects. It had utterly disregarded heritage and history in how it was remodeling one of our great cities. The project was awarded in great secrecy and great haste. So it was already controversial, and it had become absolutely untenable in the light of the current pandemic for 20,000 crores to be spent on really what is a vanity project for the Prime Minister. So that was the article. As far as the Hindustan Times is concerned, where I started my column with them 6.5 years ago, it was on the explicit assurance that nothing would be changed without my permission. In all these years, that assurance was met. Occasionally, I was asked to, drop a sentence or, remove a remark which they may have considered libelous to an individual or an organization. Usually, I pushed back. Sometimes I changed one or two words. That was it. This time, I was told this column won't be printed, but you can write on something else. So the first argument given to me by the editor was, "Oh, we are only printing corona-related stuff." I said, "This is corona-related. That the project has become untenable precisely because of corona." Then they said, "Okay, don't write this week, write next week." I said, "I'm sorry, I refuse to be subjected to this, particularly since you've given me an assurance. I am stopping my column and I will publish this piece elsewhere and I will move my column elsewhere," which is what I've done.
Ram, there's no doubt that censorship is always hateful and hurtful. But I put it to you that the Hindustan Times is neither the first nor will it be the last paper to actually refuse to publish a column. And I imagine every single paper in India at some point or another has refused to publish someone's column. And therefore, is breaking a relationship that's lasted for 6.5 years not an extreme response, or at least an impulsive response?
No, it's not. I'll explain to you. I first started a column for the Hindustan Times in 2008, which was a monthly column, on that assurance that they would not change things I'd written. In 2011, I wrote a paragraph critical of Manmohan Singh, who was then Prime Minister. Almost certainly the proprietor of the Hindustan Times removed that column because the editor removed that paragraph because the editor handling my page was then traveling covering the West Bengal elections. So I stopped my column in 2011. 2 years later, the new editor was sent by the proprietor to meet me and say, "Please restart on this assurance." So I have a history with the Hindustan Times. It's not the first time. Secondly, I may have been perhaps spoilt by writing for the Telegraph of Calcutta, particularly when it was edited by Avik Sarkar, who had allowed me in his pages to criticize the Telegraph itself. So, and of course, thirdly, I'm happy to stop writing. I don't, it may be that people who are employees of the Times of India or the Hindustan Times or the Indian Express or a website, can't afford cross their bosses too much. But in this case, because the Hindustan Times had done this once, they requested me to restart my column. They gave me an assurance it would not happen. And also, it was in the context of what we've been discussing, the growing personality cult of the Prime Minister and the creeping authoritarianism in Indian society. If it had been a column on Sachin Tendulkar, I would have said, okay. But this was clear that they were capitulating to what they felt would be
Okay.
pressure from the Prime Minister himself.
Two last questions. The Hindustan Times gave you an enormous readership. According to the December 2019 figures, apparently it's in excess of 3.2 million.
Yes.
Fortunately, now you've lost that readership, and as far as the readership's concerned, they've lost you.
Well,
Does
they
that
can read me
cause
elsewhere.
regret? Are you regretful of that?
Not at all, not at all. They can read me elsewhere. I'm writing in the NDTV, which has given me an assurance they would not change what I write, which has a much larger readership than the Hindustan Times online. I would have written, but because of what I feel about this, I would have, if NDTV had not given me a column, I would have written for a tiny website which respected my intellectual integrity and my freedom to say what I say. So I'm not in a popularity contest. If
Okay.
I was in a popularity contest, I would be in some other field,
My-
not writing serious quality books and telling the truth.
Question. What do you say to people who've said, and there have been one or two such voices, that Ram has actually broken with the Hindustan Times not over the principle of censorship, but because his pride and ego was hurt?
Not at all, because it happened before. As I said, they came back to me. It happened before. It's not a question of pride and ego. It's clear, Karan. This is a project very clear to the Prime Minister's heart. It is utterly untenable when the Prime Minister is asking all of us to sacrifice something, asking the poor and the Muslims to sacrifice the most. Can he not sacrifice his vanity project for the interests of the country? He is, as I said in my column, to go ahead with the Central Vista project at this stage would really to be despotic and authoritarian and imperial and not something what a democratic prime minister would say. So it's something, I think it's a sign of the authoritarianism in our society and the arrogance of the prime minister and the imperial nature of the prime minister. He almost sees himself as an emperor that he wants to build a new capital when there's desperation and destitution all around us.
Ram Bua, thank you very much for speaking so fully to me.
Thank you,
Stay
Karan.
safe, stay well.
You too.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.